lot of reasons why these things take a long time, and some of them you would think can be pretty simple and straightforward. There are very few that I've run across that just went like clockwork. They do involve a lot of work, and so a lot of back and forth negotiation, like Jeff said. Not to mention the tenant improvement work and working with contractors, and it's quite a bit involved.
Welcome to the Jeff Sutherlin Show. Let's grow today as we learn from decades of real estate and leadership experience.
We want you to know that when you log into this show, you're going to get authentic conversation. We're going to give it to you straight, and it's going to be real.
Hey everybody, Jeff Sutherlin and Rich Galster here. Today we're talking about the differences between commercial real estate and residential real estate. Together, Rich and I have like 45, 50 years of experience in both. So I'm excited to have you here, Rich, today to talk about these two topics.
Yeah, man. Glad to be here. Good to see you again, brother.
Absolutely. So let's just get right after it today. I want to talk about the differences in three categories today for our viewers. Number one, regulations and zoning. We want to touch on that, the differences. Also, how complex commercial can be versus residential, the different complexities. And then the timeframes of how that each of those classes can be. So let's start off with regulations and zoning. So with residential, we know that a lot of the zoning and regulations have to do with community standards, what that exact community wants. There's HOAs, there's homeowner associations, there's CC&Rs, which are covenants and restrictions for the homes. So there's things that are more like germane to that particular community. And we know that, you're not going to put a house in a heavy industrial zoned lot, right? There's certain zoning that goes for certain types of residential zoning. So Rich, what would be different on the commercial side?
Yeah, I think, like you said, the zoning overlays that the city or the county puts out is obviously a big one. So you have different types of commercial real estate, obviously industrial and office and retail, and each one of those has different zoning types that it has to fall under. I think probably the biggest distinction is with industrial. Industrial zoning is one of those that they tend to want to keep along near airport, freeways, try and keep some of that as much away from residential areas as they can. Yeah, and I think in addition to, you have the use regulation, but you also have something, you don't run into it that much in the Phoenix area, but height restrictions sometimes can be an issue, especially if you're doing a multi-story office building or residential building. Parking requirements is probably one of the biggest ones that we run into more regularly, and that can apply whether it's a purchase or even on a lease as well. Yeah, a lot of differences in zoning when it comes to residential and commercial for sure.
And to go a little bit deeper on that, one of the reasons why we won't see housing in areas near heavy industrial is a lot of that is because of hazardous materials and then things that actually can leak into the soil. There's a lot of soil testing that has to be done when you're working with certain commercial properties. When you get on the residential, there's different types of regulations there too. Like if you remember, if you've ever bought a new house, you'll realize that you're not going to probably have the same elevation of a house next to store to you. There's going to be variations. There will be variations in color. Have you ever tried to get your house painted in an HOA and try to paint it a new color? Well, if you have, you're going to have to get that basically run through the HOA for approval. So you have elevation changes, you have color schemes that have to be different, setbacks that have to be done properly. You have to pay attention to easements in residential. A lot of these things exist in commercial too. They're just different. You have easements in commercial, but there's different things, as Rich stated, on the commercial side, totally different. Anything else that we can think of on the commercial side, Rich?
Yeah, I think you mentioned soil testing. I mean, that's something I've definitely run into in a few cases. We did a project, this was actually in North Dakota, but we combined a couple of lots. One of them was a residential lot, one of them was a commercial. So we had to go through the whole process with the city of rezoning and all that. And part of that process was drilling test wells and soil testing. It was adjacent to a service gas station. Those always get a little bit tricky. Anytime you're dealing with what could have been a former gas station property, things like that, there's environmental issues that can come up. So yeah, That's a big area for sure.
Yep. And before you just automatically go out and start looking at commercial property, another one is there's certain classes of businesses that might be disallowed in an area. And yeah, you can probably guess what some of those might be. So there's certain things that just aren't allowed. It might be a smoke vape shop. It might be, something where there's some sort of nudity involved. I'm sure you can get the idea on that. So there's certain things that just aren't allowed in certain areas. So you have to check that out. Also, there might be a non-compete clause in a particular area or a plaza. Maybe you want to be a leasee, you want to be the tenant, and you have this business, but what happens if somebody else has the same business? There's a good chance you're not going to be allowed in there because of non-compete clauses with the original tenant.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So a lot of differences, and this is why we're here for you. Rich and I can ferret through all this stuff and tell you what's allowed, what's not allowed. It saves you a lot of time when you're our client. Let's bounce to transaction complexity. Boy, we had one recently, Rich, where we have a gentleman who basically, his name was Dan, and he was buying a karate studio up in Scottsdale. And this has been a great deal for us and for him because he's passionate about the martial arts. And so we started this process, goodness gracious, probably 5 months ago, looking at the right property. And, you would think on the surface, these deals would be pretty easy. We're only looking at like 2,000 square feet, empty shell space. But yet that's when it all kind of begins, right? He wants to have the right demographic, that he wants to be able to reach out to his clientele, his prospects. Then we had to have a general contractor in there to give bids, and he had somebody that he would like to use. Of course, we had suggestions. So we have to run certain people through that space to get their thoughts. What are some of the other things that you ran into, Rich? Because you did a lot on that deal to get through that one.
Yeah, I think, really kind of starting from the beginning, the process for us is really trying to identify locations, first of all, that fit what our client is looking for. Once we've narrowed that down, in this case, it was a lease. So we had to find landlords, properties where the usage would be allowed. And it's kind of funny on some of these leases, how some landlords just aren't interested. They may not want a martial arts studio in their property or whatever it might be. You mentioned some of the other ones that get a little bit more tricky, vape shops, things like that. So yeah, once we kind of identify locations and get the usage approved is really when we kind of start negotiating on the space. And I don't know how much detail you want to go into, Jeff, as far as sort of the process we walk through in actually, writing an LOI and negotiating the LOI. LOI is just a letter of intent, non-binding letter, basically outlines the main parameters that are going to go into the commercial lease at some point. So we use an LOI really in the commercial world. This is quite a bit different than residential, right? You guys typically just write up a purchase agreement and you submit it or make an offer and negotiate off that. I think because of the complexity in commercial, we usually start with a letter of intent, negotiate that back and forth. Once we've got that nailed down, and that sort of outlines the terms, the lease, the pricing, get the usage approved, a bunch of things like that. And then we go to lease, and the lease goes back and forth. And then, of course, if you have attorneys involved on, either side or both sides, then that goes back and forth, and you get, redlining that goes on for sometimes weeks. So a lot of reasons why these things take a long, long time, and some of them you would think can be pretty simple and straightforward. There are very few that I've run across that just went like clockwork. They do involve a lot of work, and so a lot of back and forth negotiation, like Jeff said. Not to mention the tenant improvement work and working with contractors, and it's quite a bit involved.
Yeah, in this particular one, we also negotiated another space that our tenant could use for next to nothing price as they were waiting for their TIs to get done. That was a huge bonus for our client, which we thought that was a huge win. So, of course, there had to be some paperwork done around that to, protect our client. Other things, too, like making sure that things like the HVAC are working properly before they actually take occupancy, because depending on the type of lease we have, for example, if you have a triple net lease, we know that the tenant is responsible for most of the expenses in the space. So before you move in, you have to make sure you do the due diligence for the client, for the person who's the tenant, because you don't want them moving into something where it's going to break down the week after they move in, right? Because that is a very expensive repair. Wouldn't you agree?
For sure. Yeah. And I think when leasing space, especially in retail centers, a lot of tenants don't know going in that they're going to be responsible for the HVAC, the HVAC unit on the roof. And obviously, if that thing goes out, that's expensive. So in most cases, you'll find that is a tenant responsibility. So we do our best to try and negotiate as much of that away as we can, or at least make sure that it's in good working order and try and get a 12-month or 24-month guarantee on it. So that way, if it does give out in the first 6 months, they're not on the hook for a 10, 15, $20,000 bill.
Yeah. And along that line, just to let everybody know, there's so many different types of leases. There's like 5 or 6 or more. I mean, so you have to pick the one that lines up perfectly for your client. I mean, we do a lot of triple net leases. And maybe you can explain that a little bit more, Rich, in more detail. But that and the fact that we run across a lot of different contracts, because a lot of the times the other side wants to use their own contract. And obviously that's going to protect them. So we have to make sure we read over that contract to protect our clients. So it's not like residential real estate where pretty much everybody uses the same contract. In Arizona, we use the Arizona Association of Realtors contract that they've vetted and they've talked to attorneys and it's been worked through for decades. Not in commercial. You could have different contracts for 5 consecutive transactions.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Actually, something we need to add on to our list of differences, because the contracts are, like you said, can be really anything. Landlords, there is kind of a standard form lease that we do see called AIR CRE forms. We do use in commercial, but a lot of landlords, in the case of leases, will have their own attorney draft their own lease. Purchase agreements, depending on who's doing the deal, they may want to write their own or have their attorney write their own. So yeah, no, not a lot of standardized forms in commercial.
Yeah. And this is where the technical aspect of commercial is really critical. I mean, we have to have somebody that understands the contracts, understands the software, understands how to get criteria to the client with data mining. This is where we really crush it for our clients. We have access to some amazing tools so they can see everything that's going on in the area. Income, demographics, traffic patterns, what are the businesses that are around there? What do people like to do? So these are the kind of things we do for the people that want to lease. So there's a lot to it. We'll go into that, I'm sure, at a deeper level down in the future. The last thing is I want to talk about time frame. Now, with residential, you know what? Honestly, it's usually 30 days, around 30 days. In fact, I just wrote a contract last week. It was a gentleman who has a trust out of Alaska, and he was buying a home for his daughter, which was awesome. And his daughter was going to live right next to his other daughter. And because it was a trust and it was a cash deal, we wrote that contract for about 18-day close. For about an 18-day close. The reason I usually do about a 15 to 18-day close in residential is you still want the client to be able to go through their due diligence process. In Arizona, that's about 10 days. So you want to give them the opportunity to do a deep dive on the property and then give the seller time to respond. If it wasn't for the inspection period and the due diligence, we could close it a lot earlier, but I never want to have my buyers feel like they're under the gun to get to a closing date and not have them pay attention to, the most critical things of the deal, which is the seller disclosures and the inspection and looking at the title report, looking at the HOA demand letter to make sure that they're okay with the HOA's okay with what they're transferring to the new buyer, looking at the CCNRs and HOA regulations. Is this a place they actually do want to live? Right. So every time a new disclosure is given to a buyer in a residential transaction in Arizona, they technically have 5 days to review it. And if it's a brand new disclosure that's material, the buyer can literally cancel. So there's all kinds of things in the real estate transaction as far as time frame. It can go as I've seen deals close in, 5 days, 6 days. Everything's negotiable, but very different. In the commercial world, you don't see very many commercial deals getting done in less than 30 days.
No, for sure. And the biggest part of that really is the due diligence period. And again, everything is negotiable. So due diligence periods, there's no standardized number, and it depends a lot on who our client is. If we're representing an owner user versus an investor looking to buy an investment property, the investment properties are probably a little bit more detailed because we're doing a deep analysis of all the leases that are in place and what is the net operating income and really trying to vet all those numbers. I've had many, many deals where we ran across numbers that weren't correct. Some that actually worked to our benefit, where after we closed the deal, we were able to determine that, hey, the net operating income was actually quite a bit higher than what they were. So some of those can be a win, right? So, but a lot of times, we try and get at least 60 days due diligence if we can on a deal. I've had situations, particularly when we're talking about zoning issues, where, not only did we have 60 days, 90 days of due diligence, we then had to go back and ask for extensions just because the work with the city and the rezoning, all of that just takes time. In fact, takes a lot longer than you might expect. So I've had deals that took over a year to complete, and they do get frustrating at times, but it does keep it interesting for sure. So yeah, I think again, the biggest difference really of the due diligence period is something that, can really draw things out.
Especially when you work with municipalities, that's when it gets very slow. When you have to work with the government, unfortunately, it's not as quick as it should be. But can you think of any other things that you've seen come up during due diligence that might slow the deal down or lose momentum?
Yeah, I think when you're dealing with a lender, in most cases, we're dealing with at least some borrowed money. There are cash deals out there. Most, even investors, generally they want to use some leverage. So anytime there's a bank or a lender, any kind of lending institution involved, then we've got to kind of jump through all those hoops too. And sometimes they'll run across things that require more time to work through.
Yeah, in fact, we recently represented a chiropractor who is moving his practice over to a veterinarian facility, an old veterinarian facility. And so he was working with our lender and working through that. And it takes a little bit of time, especially when you're dealing with loans such as SBA loans and things like that. There's some governmental checks and balances on that and, overseeing of that. So, those things take time. They have to go through underwriting. All loans have to go through underwriting, whether in residential or commercial. But the other thing I was thinking about on the commercial side, again, is environmental checks, right? Environmental checks on the property before the actual buyer takes transfer of the property.
For sure.
So yeah, there's quite a bit. So, it's the point of today was to give you guys some high level examples of the differences between residential and commercial real estate. We've touched on a lot of things. We touched on timeframes, regulation, zoning, transaction complexity, property types, financing. How do you evaluate the property? How do you price it? And how do you look at it from an investment versus occupancy side? So in Arizona, we do both. Rich and I do both. And you can connect with either one of us and we can get you on the path to either leasing a commercial property, renting it out, or being a tenant, buying one or selling one. Rich, how many years have you had in commercial and just overall understanding how to do commercial deals?
It's been well over 20 years now. And I think I mentioned last time I got my start more as an investor and did some development projects. So I really kind of learned, boots on the ground. Like I got most of my experience with the just talk about the rezoning and how to do purchase contracts and how to negotiate, how to work with the city. All of those things, I had all of that knowledge and experience really before I even got my license. And then moving to Arizona, I'd already done a lot of different stuff back in North Dakota, where I came from. I had experience in retail, multifamily, like I said, development projects, things like that. So when I came to Arizona, it was really, I was kind of open to doing anything. And that really has stuck. Even in Arizona, I've done industrial, I've done land, I've done office, we've done leases, we've done purchases, investment properties, retail centers, worked on getting leases in those retail centers to improve the value of that property, things like that. So, and last year I got my CCIM designation, which is one of the kind of the premier, the highest designation you can get in commercial world. And that really was a multi-year process and pretty extensive. They do an exam twice a year, and it was challenging for sure. I enjoyed the process, learned a lot, have some really, really great tools that came out of that I use, almost every day in this business now.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks for sharing your background. So between Rich and I, we have approximately 46 years in this business together, and in our different ways that we've our pathways so we can help you, whatever it is, residential or commercial in Arizona. And just give us a call if you want to just throw some ideas against the wall. We have a gentleman right now who's going to be meeting with us soon who he's a handyman and he wants to teach classes to get families involved coming in and learning how to do things around the house. It's kind of neat. He's working on a curriculum and he's excited to talk to us, Rich, about getting a smaller space. And he's my handyman in my networking group. And he's got this beautiful curriculum where he can invite parents and their kids in and then teach them how to do something. So it's great for the family. You get to spend time with people and fathers and mothers can teach their children. And it's just a great concept. So this is an idea he has, and he's going to do a proof of concept in his backyard and invite people in. And once he dials this in, he's going to want us to basically find him a space. So these are the kind of things we work in the commercial side, which are so fun, so exciting.
Yeah, that's really cool. What a great idea.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So Rich, how can they get a hold of you if anybody wants to call you?
480-256-9265.
And my number is 602-370-7174. We look forward to talking to you later. I hope this was beneficial. Yeah, look us up. We'll talk soon.